Our days run on screens, theirs ran on stone and fire for 2.6 million years, and this video shows what they did and why it matters. We picture cavemen, only hunting or hiding, but evidence shows varied, careful routines. Skip it and you miss the skills that kept families alive. From first light to embers, what filled a normal day. If we want to rebuild a single day from long ago, we begin by reading objects as traces of activity. Stone refitting can show where a flake was struck, and where the tool was used, tying a scatter of chips to a single episode of making. Layers of hearth ash and repeated hearths mark places where embers were raked, food warmed, or hides dried. Cut marks on bone and patterns of heat alteration tell us which parts of a carcass were removed first and which were roasted at the camp. Tiny plant remains, starch grains, and phytoliths survive on tools and in dental plaque, whispering which roots, seeds, or fruits were eaten. Biomolecules add another layer. Ancient DNA can identify species from bone fragments, and ancient proteins help when DNA is gone. Together, these methods let us move from fragments to routines. Dating anchors those routines in time. Radiocarbon and luminescence and argon dating, are part of the chronologist's toolkit, so the order of occupations makes sense rather than seeming random. But the way a site forms matters as much as the dates. Taphonomy, the study of what happens to things after they are left, teaches caution. Caves keep ash, tools, and bones safe from wind and flood, so they survive where open camps often do not. That preservation makes caves loom large in our story, yet caves can also gather strange mixes of deposits and uses, and some cave finds have prompted heated debate about who left them and why. Once these threads are pulled together, a simple scene appears: a hearth rimmed with a scatter of tiny flakes, a few blackened bones, a stone whose broken parts refit like a puzzle, and plant microremains clinging to a scraper. Is this morning chores or the day's close? Before we answer, the wider clock of light and season comes into view, shaping the tasks to come. Fire enters the story in fragments and shadows. Some researchers argue that hominins were using controlled burning at least 1 million years ago, while the clearest substantial hearths turn up later in the record. Most famously, at an Israeli Handak site, where thick ash lenses make a strong case for deliberate hearths about 800,000 years ago. By the middle of the Pleistocene, the pattern changes from occasional charcoal to repeated, clearly maintained hearths. The record begins to show not just single flames, but places where fire was kept and managed. That change matters because keeping embers overnight is a different skill from kindling a new blaze each morning. Ethnographic observations suggest people will carry a smoldering log while they move, and then coax it back to flame when they stop. Evidence from later horizons hints that hominins learned similar practical routines, banking coals, raking surfaces, and concentrating ash where they worked. In landscapes with little wood, charred bone also appears as a fuel substitute, showing a practical response to local limits, and a habit of tending fires through cycles of use. Whether a community kept a night hearth or relit fires each day would shape the whole rhythm of labor. If embers were tended, mornings could begin by coaxing coals and warming bodies. If fires had to be made anew, time and effort were spent on deliberate fire-making skills. Both paths demand planning, reserves of fuel, watchful sleepers, and social arrangements for who carries flame and who feeds it. The archaeology thus traces a slow arc, from scattered signs of burning to habitual hearths, and then to organized fire spaces that anchor work, warmth, and talk. The next step in that story is the work fire did for food and craft, how heat changed what could be eaten, and how tools were made. Morning light found people weighing two kinds of danger, weather and beasts. Camps were chosen with those dangers in mind. Caves offered windbreaks and water, and could be cleared by fire before people moved in open-air sites. By contrast, were favored when the weather allowed, because they put people close to springs, flint, or rich hunting ground. Sightlines mattered. A broken ridge or a stand of trees could hide a lion or a pack. A raised ledge could give watchers an early glimpse. Evidence suggests fires were sometimes kept burning for several days. One patch of oxidized soil at Kubai is read as a hearth tended over time, likely less for cooking than to deter predators and warm the camp. People also moved fire with them, carrying smoldering logs that could be rekindled quickly when the group stopped. How did they balance warmth and risk in any given place? By reading terrain, wind, and the animals that shared it, and by arranging hearths and sleeping places accordingly. At night, the camp became a small constellation of care. Embers were banked, fuel stacked, and someone, perhaps a rotating watch, kept a smoldering heart alive. Fire extended the social day, turning raw survival into repair, teaching, and storytelling, while keeping large carnivores at bay. Yet scholars also note that fire could draw unwelcome attention. The long arc of predator extinctions and survivals shaped these choices. Some carnivores disappeared, while others like wolves remained dangerous partners on the landscape. These nightly practices, where to sleep, which embers to save, how to leave a camp defensible, made mobility possible too. In the quiet after the last sparks, minds turned to the next move. When the trail called, which pieces of the fire would be carried and which would be left behind as the group rose and walked toward new water and wood. Landscape was not background, it was the first clock of the day. On open savannas, life tuned to the long view. Eyes learned the horizon. Hunters and watchers moved with steadier feet, following animals across grass, returning in the slow meander that ethnographers compare to modern-day Hadza patterns. Scanning, tracking, and patient pursuit fit a world where herds and wide sightlines made movement predictable and planning easier. In woodlands, the rhythm softened. Shade and trees hid both game and food. People turned their hands to digging and gathering roots and tubers that grew under cover, birds and small mammals that slipped between trunks. The work was quieter and closer to ground. Tools were smaller, movements frequent, and camps often hugged the edge of forest and field where both resources could be reached without long travel. Where steppe and tundra opened out, another set of habits took shape. The land offered huge herds and predictable prey, but it also brought cold and sparseness. Fuel became a serious concern. Stores of wood, bone, and fat were important to keep embers alive. Clothing and bulky coverings mattered more when nights bit hard. Camps here often sat where different habitats touched, ecotones that let people move quickly from grazing herds to sheltered patches of wood or reed. In every zone, the same practical decisions kept reappearing: where to sleep so the fire could be tended, how far to walk for water, and how to carry back the richest parts of a carcass. These routines made camps into small, reliable worlds. Morning circuits gathered water and fuel, midday quiet held mending and teaching, evenings braided food, story, and embers. When savanna met woodland or steppe edged a river, life opened more choices, an advantage that helped shape where people set their hearths and how they spent their hours. As seasons shifted and cold spread, those choices tightened, leading us into the winter work of the mammoth steppe. If we step quietly into one of those long-ago days, the first thing to notice is rhythm rather than clockwork. Evidence suggests people moved between short, intense tasks and long stretches of maintenance, teaching, and rest. Fire shifted that rhythm. Where hearths glowed, evenings lengthened, and talk and craft could spill past dusk. Sites with preserved hearths and smoldering branches left at abandonment tell us embers were tended, raked, and sometimes deliberately banked. Schoeningen's burned stave and hearth remains show fire was an ordinary recurring focus. How long did a workday actually feel? Cooking alone offers one clue. Compared with raw diets, cooking may have saved several hours a day that were otherwise spent chewing opening space for other chores, conversation, or leisure. Ethnographic comparisons and archaeological patterns also point to a midday lull, cooler hours for mending, sorting, and quiet tasks, framed by bursts of intense effort for hunting, butchery, or mass craft work. Craft production gives clearer time estimates. At Sunghyr, thousands of carved beads, each taking many minutes to make, add up to thousands of hours of labor. When carved objects cluster on living floors, the record hints at specialists or shared projects occupying days and seasons. Tool refresh rates and dense napping debris around hearths show routine maintenance, resharpening blades, trimming hafts, and sweeping ash into dumps. Faunal remains with patterns of selected transport and repeated butchery suggest days could be dominated by a successful hunt's flurry of work, followed by calmer days of plant gathering and teaching. So the workday was flexible, built from a few high-demand tasks and long stretches of lower-intensity care, fire, tending, hide scraping, and the patient apprenticeship of children watching at the hearth. The next question is why some of that work became meaningful enough to be kept marked and repeated. How ordinary objects became symbols around the fire. We can sketch a day from hearth to sleep, but many ordinary scenes remain lines of argument among scholars. The first question is fire itself. Some researchers see hearths and nighttime gatherings as ancient and central to daily life. Others treat early evidence more cautiously. A related idea, that a fuller story-rich kind of talk may have appeared soon after 400 years ago, has been offered as a way to imagine evenings filled with shared memory and planning, but that timing is debated, and the link between language and deliberate night fires is not settled. The second debate is about how meat entered the camp. One view emphasizes active hunting, coordinated drives, spears, and planned kills. Another stresses opportunism, scavenging, taking advantage of what larger predators left behind. Both behaviors leave fragments in the archaeological record, and scholars often infer different life rhythms from the same clues. That uncertainty changes whether we picture long stalks and ambushes or short, repeated returns with chosen portions of carcasses. Finally, who did what? How tasks were divided by age and sex is a long-standing question. Early methods tried to read sex roles from bone measurements and finger ratios, but some techniques have been criticized. Other evidence, like pigments and cave use, suggests men, women, and children shared many spaces and activities. Children's footprints and tiny tools hint at learning by doing. Older bodies with heavy wear hint at roles beyond fast hunting, direction, memory, and teaching. Yet scholars disagree about how commonly tasks followed strict divisions or flexed with circumstance. None of these debates erases the everyday picture: embers coaxed at dawn, repaired tools by midday, and shared food at dusk. What we cannot yet agree on is how those routines were organized in full, what lasted unchanged, and what changed with new tools and urgent seasons. What endured into our own days will be the next gentlest question. Our screens measure time in pulses and pings. Long before that rhythm, people shaped the day around light embers and shared work. Archaeology shows hearths, ash, lenses, stone flakes, and bones moved and altered by hands and tools. Those traces do not give a clock, but they give a pattern: mornings warmed by coals, hours spent gathering and mending, big tasks carried out in company, and evenings folded around fire and storytelling. What did cavemen actually do all day? Imagine a first light where coals are coaxed back to life, smoke easing into a cold air that the camp will hold against the day. Small tasks ripple outward from the hearth: water fetched, fuel trimmed, scraps warmed, bones cracked for marrow. Children and elders sit near the heat, learning by watching. Nappers resharpen tools with tiny regular flakes. Some groups make short walks to predictable patches of plants or shorelines. Other days are given to organized drives or close work with spears. Midday is quieter, mending, sorting fibers, and quiet rest in shade. As light thins, embers are banked, food is shared, and conversations braid, planning with memory. The material record suggests this was not a single template, but a recurring human logic: keep warm, get calories, repair tools, teach, and bind the group. The archaeologist's eyes read where patterns: hearth clusters and repeat deposits as rhythms rather than precise schedules. In plain terms, the traces show habits, what was often done, not the minute it was done. Picture someone nudging a coal and a child cupping warm breath to it, the soft clack of flint, the scent of roasted marrow, folding the morning into place. These moments repeat like a slow communal clock. Next, we will ask who those people were and why so many of our images of cavemen miss the truth of everyday places. When people say cavemen, they often mean a single picture: rough stone, dark grooves in rock silhouettes by firelight. The truth is quieter and more varied. Many Paleolithic people lived in open camps beside rivers, lakes, and coasts as often as they sheltered in caves. Early Homo Neanderthals and the ancestors of our own species each found ways to make a place for daily life in whatever landscape they occupied. Morning could begin by coaxing a bed of embers back to life, or by walking to a nearby spring with a carrying container tucked under an arm. Fuel was gathered, food stores sorted, and small repairs made to tools and clothing. Where the shore was close, people checked the tide and gathered shellfish. Where wood and grass were abundant, they shaped rough shelters and dried plant foods. These choices were practical and shaped by what each place offered. Daily life was a continuous response to water, wind, and the seasonal map written on the land. A morning might smell of wet grass and smoke, with someone bundling kindling for the hearth before the camp stirred, fully awake. The shapes of a single day changed with climate and technology. In some places, hunting required coordinated drives; in others, people depended more on tubers, seeds, and the steady return of fish or shellfish. Children learned at the hearth edge, imitating flake removal and the careful passing of hot stones. Elders kept knowledge of places and seasons, and injured bodies were tended and shared. Evenings braided work into story and planning for the next day, while embers were banked for night watches. This ordinary choreography of fire, food, tools, care, and teaching is the living heart behind the older label cavemen. How do we piece together these quiet routines from the stones and ash they left behind? Seasons were the long, slow clock that shaped tasks more than whim. Over many generations, ice advanced and retreated in broad beats, cold troughs and warmer peaks with shorter, sharper wiggles between them. These rhythms set whether the land was a hard, pale steppe or a greener corridor, whether rivers froze or ran lively, and whether herds moved through or stayed away. In the long view, warm peaks and cold troughs came in a pattern researchers call interglacials and glacials. Each stage itself had colder and warmer pulses. That changing background meant daily life was never wholly the same from year to year. These long beats were legible in small signals: muddy riverbanks, the first green shoots, and the distant calls of breeding animals. So people learned to read the year like a map. Within each season, shorter, predictable windows opened and closed. Day length and temperature decided when people could safely spend hours on exposed slopes, wade the shallows for shellfish, or wait in ambush where animals watered. Animal teeth show seasonal signatures that tell us when creatures died. Mixed banding in teeth from some camps suggests people used places at different times of year rather than only in one season. In very cold months, people may have spent more time clustered by fire and sleeping, as later ethnographic parallels suggest in milder spells daylight stretched work for gathering, making cordage, or repairing tools. So a day was a patchwork tied to light, and the larger climate clock. Dawn might be for checking embers and short urgent tasks, midday for mending and shade work, late afternoon for scouting herds or coastal foraging, time to tides and animal movements, evening for cooking, sharing, and teaching. How those pieces fit depended on the season, on whether the world outside the hearth was thin ice or flowering green. At first light they would lift embers and prepare the day ahead. A low shared rhythm stitched households together across years. Dawn at a hearth is small work and soft light. Before the sun climbs, hands rake ash into shallow circles, searching for the warm heart. A coal is coaxed with breath, a bundle of twigs arranged so the flame will spread. Hearth clusters and thin ash lenses found at places like Cavemen Cave, and in many Middle Paleolithic shelters, show this was routine, not a one-off. The arrangement of stones, the pockets of charcoal, the repeated floors, all suggest people tended fire as a daily task, moving embers, adding fuel, and shaping the glow so it would last through cold hours and give light for early chores. Ash and charcoal preserve especially well in sheltered spots, so what survives is a partial, but telling record of a very familiar repeated practice. Keeping the embers alive did more than warm bodies. Fire first thing meant light for work, flint struck and edges checked by ember glow, and a steady heat to make tough food safer to eat. The morning hearth turned yesterday's scraps into breakfast marrow, could be warmed, roots softened, and bitter fibers mellowed by steady low heat. Heat breaks down tough fibers and many plant toxins, easing chewing and digestion, and this change is visible in burned bone and charred plant fragments left at camps. The smell of smoke, the close hush around coals, and the small careful movements of passing hot stones are the quiet scenes the archaeology allows us to imagine. From these embers, a whole day grows. Water and fuel must be fetched, tools readied, and routes planned for forage and hunt. Sometimes a child squats at the edge watching a parent roll a hot pebble into the embers, learning how to move heat without burning. Vessels for carrying water rarely survive long, but finds like ostrich eggshell flasks and certain shells remind us people planned ahead for the morning circuit of fetching water and wood. The morning hearth is therefore not merely a place of warmth, it is the small hub around which Aaron's teaching and the day's logistics begin. That slow, steady tending of fire leads naturally into the next tasks, collecting fuel, filling containers, and setting out along familiar paths. Dawn often began with a short-circuit, water, fuel, and the green things that would fill the day. Camps are frequently found where water and wood came together, along springs, rivers, and edges of woodland, and that pattern is itself evidence. Where people camp tells a quiet story. You do not dig hearths under trees you never visit. At places like Cherningen and rock shelters such as Abric Romani, archaeologists find hearths and nearby signs that branches and even large trunks were brought close to the living area. Those are traces of repeated trips of people who knew which bend in the river held reed beds and which fallen limb would burn slow and hot. Carrying containers rarely survive in the archaeological record, so we read the landscape and the debris instead. Ash lenses, clusters of hearths, and the scatter of burned bones show that water was fetched and fuel was tended as routine tasks. In some landscapes, bone itself became a reliable fuel, leaving burned fragments in hearth hollows where timber was scarce. The sound of morning would have been measured in small snaps and distant water. Stones moved to clear a spring-dry twig snapped for a firebox, roots pulled from dark earth and rinsed clean. Smoke rose in thin columns carrying warmth and the camp's small talk. These circuits were short, repeated, and social. A child might steady a vessel while an elder poached a green shoot. A napper might carry a sharp flake back to the hearth while another stacked wood for the afternoon. The evidence suggests habit more than heroic steady rounds that kept warmth, drink, and simple food within reach. From these circuits, the day unfolded into cooking, teaching, and the next small plan for the camp. What came next at the hearth edge would be breakfast. Morning light fell first on embers that had been banked through the night, and the day's first meals often began with what the fire already held. The record shows burned bone fragments and stones fractured by heat, and microscopic plant starch caught in dental calculus, all of which suggests that cooking was part of ordinary life rather than a rare experiment. So a breakfast might have been a quiet, warm remaking of yesterday's work, strips of roasted meat that had been sliced off a joint, small pieces reheated until fat glistened, and a bowl of roots or tubers turned soft by the coals. The air would have smelled of smoke-rich marrow and the faint sweetness of roasted plant flesh, simple flavors made easier on tired mouths and hungry bodies. Even small routine uses of heat changed what people could eat, breaking down tough fibers and concentrating energy. Over time, fire turned leftovers into reliable calories, smoothing the day's labor and conversation like a warm, shared rhythm. The evidence in bones and teeth shows this was repeatable, not accidental. Long bones were prized for what they hid inside. People cracked them with heavy stones to reach the fatty marrow, a calorie-dense reward that other predators could not easily extract. Stone tools and deliberate bone breakage in the archaeological record show this was done again and again. Plant foods, roots, tubers, seeds, fruits, and berries, were important too, though they leave fewer traces. Their presence appears through starches and residues, and through the logic of human nutrition. Roasting and pounding would have made many plants more digestible. Children likely hovered at the hearth's edge, watching where hands moved, learning which bones to lift and which coals to stir, as the small routines of food and care shaped the morning and set the camp's rhythm for the day ahead. Soft prints in ash and soft mud tell part of the story. At places like La Roselle, archaeologists find small footprints and short stride lengths clustered near hearths, the scatter of marks, naming many young bodies moving close to the central fire. You can almost feel the warm air, smoke that smells of char and dried grass, the low hiss when fat drips on a hot stone, the hush as a child edges nearer and then steps back. These prints sit among stones darkened by heat, and the broken tips of tools showing that children shared the same activity spaces as adults, watching, waiting, and learning the rules of the hearth. The short steps suggest staying near caregivers' hands, often empty or holding simple objects, while elders kept the hottest work a little farther out. Learning here was quiet and gradual practice, woven into ordinary work. Evidence suggests children learned by watching from safe distances how to hand off a warm pebble so it did not burn a palm, how to avoid a sharp flake, how to sit just beyond the ring of coals. Adults repeated small gestures, passing an ember wrapped in bark, tilting a stone so it cooled on sand, pointing out which implements cut and which were for scraping leather. Play sometimes looked like small tasks set by elders, fetching a twig, keeping watch for sparks, carrying a cool flake. Those chores were lessons disguised as work, giving practice without the cost of a burned hand. Those afternoons of imitation and correction built skill without hurry. As the embers settled and hands reached for fresh flakes, the day moved on to another steady chore, sharpening tools that would shape tomorrow's work. Just after first light, the hearth was the workbench. Folks gathered where the coals still glowed, and with quiet practiced gestures checked edges the way we check tools in a kitchen drawer. Archaeology shows tiny flakes and refits collected near hearths and sleeping spots, the pale glittering evidence of repeated careful resharpening. Scrapers where touched-up hand axes were rejuvenated, and flakes that once split meat and bark were pared back to a new cutting line. Scholars note that many tools were used again and again until the edge was finally spent, and that much of the retouching we see in the record looks like straightforward resharpening rather than the making of new shapes. The worn polish on some cutting edges tells another part of the story. These tools did woodwork as often as they did meat, and morning repairs kept them ready for both. The gestures were small and steady, a core held in one hand, a controlled strike with the other, a shower of tiny flakes brushed into a neat pile. Camps show traces of this debris swept into ash lenses and loose dumps, places where old napping waste sat beside the cinder of the hearth. Those ash-rich spots could be practical stores, tinder waiting insulation under new floors, or simply clean places to bury what had worn out. Maintenance was not an occasional task, but a rhythm that structured the day, turning broken edges into renewed tools and teaching younger hands the fine, patient motions of craft. Those repeated repairs were also social moments, binding generations through quietly shared gestures and rules of care that kept the camp functioning together. From these small acts flowed readiness for the next step outside the circle of smoke. Where would they go to gather, and whom would they meet? Before the sun climbs high, much of the day is already decided in the mind. People kept mental maps of the landscape, where the swollen reed beds hid tubers, where a river shallowed last week and drew game, which slope held dry wood after a storm. Evidence suggests some hunts, ambushes of migratory animals, required advanced planning in colder times, while other approaches could be opportunistic. Both strategies could live together. Skilled observation and an urge to explore meant that names and stories were layered onto the land. A knuckle of rock, a bend in the river, a lone pine. These markers worked like notes in a song, helping groups return to the same patches when the season came round, or to meet each other at a known ford. In the quiet before work, someone might trace the route in memory, the feel of the path underfoot, and the sound of water serving as navigation. These mental maps combined routes, timing, and social arrangements, who to meet where and when. Practical decisions followed these maps. If good stone lay only at distant outcrops, some people carried cores and pre-shaped tools so the group could work later. The arrival of foreign rock at camps suggests routes and planning beyond a single day. Small valuables, seeds, insects clinging to boots, were taken forward and left behind, spreading plants and knowledge together. Small hands often pocketed seeds or plant pieces, quietly helping useful species move across the landscape. Night gatherings and stories stitched mental maps between bands so rendezvous were possible and knowledge could cross groups. The result was a rhythm of errands and returns, short circuits for water and fuel, longer circuits for prime resources, and shared memory that turned places into dependable larders. Next, we will linger with those plant larders themselves, tubers, seeds, and the quiet craft of turning them into food. When people ask what early foragers spent their hours on, the quiet answer is often gathering and turning plants into steady food. Archaeologists now find tiny particles of silica and trapped starch on old grinding stones and tools. Studies of 100-year-old Middle Stone Age tools in some African rifts have revealed starches from both underground and above-ground plants, and 30-year-old grinding stones in Europe carry starch grains that look like early flour making. These microremains show that plants were not an occasional snack. They were a dependable part of daily calories. Some residues are even trapped in dental plaque, preserving a personal record of meals and preparation. So how did hidden roots and hard seeds become food people could rely on? Evidence suggests practice and heat. Grinding stones bear the marks of pounding and milling hearths, and charred fragments show roasting. Roasting breaks down fibers and helps remove bitter or toxic compounds, while pounding and grinding turns tough seeds into pastes or flours. The result is food that stores, shares, and fuels work. Softened tubers warmed on coals seed meal, mixed with fat breads of wild grains long before farming. Tooth wear and tool shapes also hint that chewing and processing were routine parts of the day. Picture a morning light on wet grass, someone testing a patch, for roots the slow rhythm of a pestle, on a stone the smell of warm starch rising from embers. Children might sort small seeds elders recall, where certain plants hide moisture, and a banked fire turns the day's haul into something digestible and calm. Along some shores, these plant circuits met with tides and shellfish, another predictable rhythm that shaped how people planned their next day. At the shore, a child might roll small seeds between thumb and finger while an elder tends embers. Morning on a shoreline was measured in the language of water. People watched the curve of the sand and the slow pull of the sea, planning brief trips to rocky pools where limpets and seaweed clung, or to estuaries where large mussels waited. Baskets, carried by women and children in some scenes the record preserves, came back heavy with small, reliable calories. The tide created a daily window, a predictable supply that could be checked and rechecked safer, and nearer than long hunting forays. Evidence from coastal sites shows repeated piles of shells and food debris laid down over time, the quiet record of many such mornings and evenings. The low tide offered a simple schedule, a strip of life that appeared was taken, and then returned to sleep. That regularity made shellfish a dependable fallback, smoothing the sharp ups and downs of a hunting calendar. Those short, frequent circuits kept camps anchored and social life steady. While some people ventured farther for large game or raw stone, others kept close to the hearth, warming the catch, breaking shells, roasting small fish, and tending coals for the next foray. Shell-based economies seem to have demanded an ability to read tides and schedules in the sea, an ordinary form of knowledge as vital as knowing where springs hide inland. The shore offered protein and a rhythm that shaped storage, childcare, and craft. Dry the catch, mend nets or bindings, teach a child which rock pools are safest. And when the tide closed the day, the camp's fires gathered everyone back together, before the more deliberate work of organized hunts took center stage. That steadiness also created spare hours, small pockets of time for mending, teaching, and quiet exchange of stories and seasonal plans. Around the fire, children learned the seas maps, and elders passed down rules for when and where to gather, so knowledge traveled with the tides. On ordinary days, people moved in small circuits, checking water and fuel, tending the hearth, gathering plants and small prey. But some days were different. The archaeology preserves moments of organized violence and planning. In deep, damp soils, we find long, carefully made wooden spears, examples from places like Schoningen and a broken tip at Clacton, objects that were part of very old hunts. At Schoningen, those spears lay with many horse skeletons, suggesting they were used at distance experiments, and the spear's shape make throwing a plausible use. Making and maintaining long wooden spears took time and knowledge of wood and balance, showing planning before a hunt. Hunts were choreographed like a short, careful play, with roles for throwers, drivers, and close-up attackers. In other places, Neanderthals crept through dense hornbeam toward a lakeshore where deer could be trapped, or they used short-hafted stone points for close thrusting. Some sites hint at massed kills, lots of mammoth bones piled together with Gravettian points, though the reason those collections formed can be slippery in the record. When an animal fell, the work shifted to speed and choice. At Boxgrove, the bones show people had primary access and cut carefully, opening carcasses and taking the richest parts for camp. Butchery corridors and rapid field processing preserved meat and marrow and reduced drag on the journey home. Elsewhere, the marks on bone and the presence or absence of carnivore damage suggest different sequences, sometimes primary hunting, sometimes scavenging. These patterns tell us that hunting was not a single habit, but a set of strategies. Ambush javelin throws driving herds, close thrusts, chosen for place, prey, and weather. Those choices, what to butcher on site and what to carry, were guided by simple rules of fuel spoilage and distance back to camp. How the bones record those choices will guide us deeper into how people shared and stored the day's labor. Bones are a kind of ledger. The order of marks on a rib or thigh bone, whether a tooth scored the surface before a stone cut it or the other way around, tells a story about the first people at the carcass. Where cut marks overprint tooth marks, archaeologists read that people arrived after predators and scavenged what remained. Where cuts come first, it looks more like active butchery at a fresh kill. This detail has driven decades of debate about hunting power scavenging and passive scavenging. Some sites show clear, deliberate kills and large-scale butchery, while others resemble the work of those joining the vultures. In many places, the patterns repeat: stone tools clustered with bones, deliberate dismembering, and bones cracked open for their rich stores of fat. Careful study of edge angles, the depth of scores, and microscopic, where helps investigators read that sequence like paleographers deciphering a script. Those broken bones tell us about sharing and planning at camp. People did not always carry whole carcasses. The parts moved to hearths were often the fattier, marrow-filled pieces, and skulls prized for brains. A long bone split with a clean percussion scar suggests a nearby hearth, a central place where marrow could be processed and passed around. Imagine the quiet, a blunt stone striking hollow bone, warm grease glistening, as it is scooped out, small hands learning which morsels to save for the old and the young. Nearby smoke curled low, while embers warmed stones, and voices passed along recipes for saving and sharing. Such decisions imply planning and agreed rules about sharing within the group. These choices, what to leave, what to haul, how to divide, made a day's work into social care and survival. How that labor eased into the midday quiet shapes what we find next: mending, resting, and tending the fire. Midday in a small camp folded into shade can look at first like a pause in the story of the day. Hunters have gone off, the sun is high, voices drop. What fills that quiet are low, steady tasks passed from hand to hand. Children rest near the hearth's edge while older men and women sit working with pieces of hide and lengths of root. Rope is being twisted, leather is being scraped until it is supple, and plant fibers are sorted into bundles for mats or ties. The scrape of stone on skin, the soft give of fiber between thumb and forefinger, the faint scent of smoke and warm oil make a rhythm that is both practical and slow. Those hands are also teaching hands. Children learn techniques by watching, by touch, and by copying small motions. A child may carefully knot a fresh cord under an elder's guidance, feeling how fibers give and hold. The camp hums like a slow machine, each repair a small gear that keeps the day moving. Fire itself is part of the midday choreography. Some embers are banked, ashes are shifted to tidy activity areas, milk pots and other vessels may be smoked and cleaned in preparation for the evening. Time freed by cooked food and managed fire lets people invest hours in repair, mending bindings, trimming footwear, rehafting tools, and in personal care like grooming to remove parasites. These chores are not small chores of leisure, but the craftwork that keeps a camp alive. Cordage for carrying treated hides for warmth and clean hearths to welcome returning hunters. Tending embers and washing pots are practical hygiene and efficiency. A tidy hearth sends less smoke, cooks more evenly, and keeps pests down. Soon fingers return to flint and tinder, testing sparks in the banked coals. As the light eases toward late afternoon, hands pause and plans are shared, a quiet movement toward rekindling the day's heat and the work of making fire again. They tended the fire as a daily tool. Cooking made meat safer to eat and roots easier to digest, and the archaeological record carries the small signatures of those tasks: fragments of burned bone, heat-altered stone, and charred plant pieces that speak of repeated meals and careful tending. The smell of smoke and roasting would have been constant near living spaces. Soft light, a hiss, as juices met hot coals, stones warm to hold heat through the night. These traces show cooking was not a rare novelty, but part of a routine rhythm that shaped what people carried who gathered each day, and how mouths and bodies adapted to a cooked diet. Cooked food needs less chewing and breaks down more quickly inside the gut, so everyday cooking eased wear on teeth and made calories easier to use. Around the hearth, lessons were shared as much as meals. Hands passed warmed bones and small pieces of food, while elders corrected grips and children watched the sparks. Fire also extended into craft. Evidence from some South African sites shows people deliberately heat-treated stone to make it easier to shape, using controlled fire to change rock before napping. In that way, the hearth was a workshop, as well as a kitchen. Heated stones for cooking, warmed flakes for tool-making, embers kept to alter materials for the next day's work. These overlapping uses make clear that fire was a daily technology that bound food, craft, and care into a single practice. The hearth was a workbench of living, where the same heat that softened tubers also softened stone edges, one small technology serving many needs. As embers cooled and the day moved toward night, hands that had sorted meat and stones turned toward hides and weatherproofing, another kind of work that grew from the heat of the hearth. These linked chores tied immediate comfort to longer plans for clothing, shelter, and the next day's journey. When archaeologists pick up a flake-scarred scraper or a smoothed bone, all they are holding the traces of a quiet, ordinary craft. The marks on stone and the wear on bone suggest more than an occasional task. They point to routine skin work. Hides were scraped to remove fat, and hair stretched and dried so they could be wrapped around a child, tied into a bundle, or draped over a simple frame as shelter cover. Bone awls make sense in that picture. Their tips are shaped to punch holes and push fibers through leather to make ties and lashings that held seams together or fastened skins to poles. Needles, by contrast, appear later in the record, so stitches, as we imagine them, come in after a long history of folding, tying, and patching. Until then, most joins relied on knots, thongs, and layered folds, simple solutions made durable by practice and repetition. We also read the climate and the body in other ways. Populations living in cold places and genetic traces of parasites that live close to clothing both suggest that people were wearing protections long before fine sewing tools show up. That means daily life likely included scraping in the morning, checking seams by the fire, and mending rips as a normal part of the day. Small chores that kept warmth and movement working. Often more than one pair of hands worked on a hide, teaching children and spreading skill across the group. Imagine the rasp of a scraper, the soft leather under a palm, a child watching, while an adult threads a raw thong through a hide practical patient repeated. Those threads lead naturally to the next workbench, where wood cordage and sticky mastics meet skin and stone, because cloth and ties only hold as well as the knots and bindings they depend on. Wood rarely survives the years, yet the quiet work of woodcraft left its marks. Smooth spear shafts and digging sticks preserved in a few places like Schoningen and beyond tell of hands that shaped poles to hold and pry. Small fragments of twisted fibers, sticky lumps of birch tar, and resin mixed with ochre speak of repeated tasks, twisting cordage binding points and sealing joins. These are not one-off clever moments, but the residue of habit. Afternoons spent turning rough branches into tools that fit the hand and the need. Imagine a cool afternoon near the hearth. Someone wedges a shaft against a stone and scrapes it with the same rhythm used to thin hides. Another sits with a bundle of fibers rolling and pulling until a cord tightens to the right tension. A bit of tar is heated until it softens, then pressed into a haft with ochre mixed in to stiffen the bond and maybe make it visible. The smell is resinous, warm, and a little sweet. Fingers stained with plant sap and pigment show the care taken to make a spearhead hold true or a small trap stay fast. These are slow crafts, patience, repetition, and repair. They demanded knowledge of seasons, plant textures, and controlled heat taught by watching and doing. Skills passed hand to hand, elders guiding novices with careful correction until a knot or haft felt right. The archaeology suggests these quiet labors filled many afternoons, teaching young hands the feel of a good knot and the right grain of wood. Such work also shaped camp life, where people sat who sat near the tools, and which spots needed shelter from rain and wind. The next place we look will show how these tasks fit into the plan of the camp itself, where work lived beside fire and sleep. A camp was a stitched-together circle of tasks, not a jumble. Excavations at places like a brick Romani and the structured floors of Grotte du Lazaret show hearth-centered zones where work settled into habit. The cooking fire held a center of warmth, and light flakes from toolmaking gathered in one corner, butchered bones clustered where carcasses were broken down, sleeping places hugged leeward walls or shallow depressions. This pattern suggests planning by simple rules of thumb: keep sparks and bedding apart, put heavy work where the ground is hard, and set napping where stray flakes won't scatter the sleeping area. Stone keeps its own memory. Tiny waste flakes and refit sequences mark the repeated hands that return to the same spot to shape an edge. Those repeated actions built recognizable patches on the ground, so a camp's order was as much habit as design, and the patterns archaeologists read are the echoes of that habit. Imagine the scene: a low fire hissing with fat, the soft rasp of hide scraping somewhere damp with warm breath, a flake striking stone, and ringing faintly, children's small feet pattering at the edge of the circle. Smoke and scent draw people close, butchery smells and bone shards sit downwind, easy to lift and carry. Someone sits by the embers mending a strap, another passes a warmed piece of meat to a child whose small hands are still learning where tools are sharp. The layout eased daily life: tools where they were used, food where it was processed, sleeping where embers could be banked. The organized floors and hearth lenses show routine, and that routine led to other chores: raking ash, sweeping, renewing the living surface, tasks that carried the day across into night. By mid-afternoon, the living space showed the careful hand of routine. Archaeological layers rich in ash hearth clusters and burned bone fragments suggest that people did not simply leave a fire where it fell. At places like Border Cave and Sibudu, ash was raked and spread over floors, and grass bedding lay on insulating layers of ash. That pattern fits a tidy logic: scrape away spent coals, move charred debris to a dump or to the edge of the camp, and refresh the sleeping and working surface so pests and smells stay down. Heat altered stones and bits of charcoal mix with fragments of bone in the sediment, the small sharp fragments trampled into old floors until a new clean layer was needed. These are the fingerprints of a household practice that repeats. Ash layers functioned as more than waste: they eased smells, deterred insects, and helped beds stay drier. Like a slow broom, this care kept camps usable night after night. Resurfacing could be as simple as sweeping fine ash to cover a soiled patch, or as deliberate as laying fresh bedding and burning away used material to deter insects. Keeping sparks contained was a safety matter as much as comfort. Hearths were often central, but the area around them was managed. Tool flakes, reworked scrapers, and food scraps were routinely moved, reused, or buried beneath a fresh surface, so the camp remained workable. A child might poke a glowing coal with a stick, while an elder hummed low, passing on a small practical song. These rituals of repair then folded naturally into evening conversation and planning. When the chores were done, and the floor renewed, embers glowed steady and smoke eased. Then voices came closer to the fire. What did they talk about as night settled and the next day's plans were made? Conversation leaves no fossil. Yet around a low, steady fire, the things that do survive: beads, pigments, and later simple instruments light a trail back to evenings shaped by more than calories and warmth. The ember glow would throw faces into soft relief smoke, and the sweet, oily scent of roasting meat or root would hang in the air. Hands stained with ochre shells and perforated bones that survive in the dirt, and the careful placement of objects near hearths suggest that people spent time on looks and meanings as well as work. Evidence suggests music and rhythm entered some camps in later periods, and ornaments imply deliberate marking of persons or groups. The durable items survive where speech does not. Material choices become our only notes of social life. Imagine a child tapping a hollow bone and listening to the thin tone, or someone smoothing ochre on a shell, while a low hum fills the firelight. Small moments that leave marks archaeologists can still read. These are traces of talk made visible. What did they speak of? Practical matters certainly threaded every conversation: who would tend the fire, who would carry water, which patches of land to visit at first light. But the same night could hold stories of past hunts, quiet rehearsal of routes and names, teasing and play, and low song to steady tired hands. Children near the hearth watched and imitated, learning which tools to touch and which to leave alone. Apprenticeship often happened in low light, where mistakes could be quietly corrected, and skills passed from one hand to another. Sometimes attention turned inward, comforting an injured body, recounting a remembered place, recalling who was owed a favor. The archaeological hints of care and long-healed injuries tell us that some nights were also for tending the ill and elderly. In that warm, crowded circle, survival and meaning braided together, an ordinary ritual that led in time to deliberate healing and long memories. Morning light warms the rim of the shelter. A fire burns low, someone lifts a bowl, another eases a wrapped arm to rest on a folded hide. These small acts, bringing water, keeping a body warm, feeding soft food, are the quiet labor of care. The bones we dig up sometimes keep that story. One famous skeleton from a rock shelter shows serious head trauma, crushing to one side of the body, blindness in at least one eye, infections, and partial paralysis. And yet the person lived on for several years. That survival is hard to explain without others bringing food, tending wounds, and making the daily routines of care possible. Some researchers imagine comfort came as touch and sound as much as food. gentle handling, steady presence, even music to ease stress while the body recovered. Beyond hands and hearth, knowledge about plants likely mattered. Observers have proposed that people used local succulents whose juices act as antiseptics and as a natural bandage. Such suggestions come from those who know how living communities still turn to plants when modern medicines are absent. If people did use plants in this way, that practice would have been taught and shared at the fire. How to relieve pain, check infection, and choose safe foods for a weak stomach. Most techniques would have been practical and visible, taught at the hearth, where examples could be repeated and corrected. The rhythm of tending, washing, tying, feeding, and watching, worked like a slow stitch, mending the fabric of the group. Caring for the injured would have been a slow social work, watching and feeding, cleaning and binding, repeating simple tasks day after day until strength returned. Nearby children would have watched these rhythms and learned by copying, imitating the motions that kept a group alive. How did they first learn to help? By late afternoon, the camp took on a quieter rhythm. Small feet left prints in soft ground near the hearth, short stride, lengths that speak of children moving where adults had set limits. Around those prints lay tiny chips of stone, the thin, bright flakes made when someone struck a core and missed the intended edge. Archaeology calls this small tool debitage. Uneven flake sequences where some pieces are well formed and others stop mid-cut show more than careless work, they show practice. Novices sat close enough to watch and far enough to be safe, trying imitation tasks with adult tools or deliberately smaller cores made for learning. The picture is of afternoons shaped by patient correction rather than speed. An elder or more skilled napper would lift a hand, demonstrate how the angle changed the flake, or quietly trade a hammer for a softer stone. Children learned by doing, striking, watching the chip fly, feeling the rhythm and the resistance. The air would carry the metallic smell of flint dust and the soft clack of flakes on packed earth. Patterns of imperfect flakes repeated in place and time make the teaching visible in stone. Skills were concrete, an angle learned by wrist, a rhythm learned by eye and hand together. Sometimes objects served as prompts. An older tool kept to show a sequence, a discarded flake to correct a stroke. A younger child might warm a flat stone at the edge of the fire, and then watch the elder demonstrate a safer strike. These small rituals anchored the day and tied practical skill to shared care. The record suggests these were ordinary hours of education, part craft, part play, part apprenticeship. Such learning helped keep skills alive across seasons and places. And it raises the next quiet question: who in these communities held the long memories and the stories that guided the young? In the dim circle around the hearth, age showed on the body as plainly as on a face. Heavy tooth wear preserved in many skeletons marks people who had chewed for decades. Researchers have used methods like micro-CT on dental samples to recognize older adulthood. Those worn teeth do not read as failure. They read as time spent learning the land, which roots soften after a particular frost, where the reed beds hold water even in dry years, and how cloud and wind bend before a sudden storm. In some discussions, scholars even call these elders gold mines of knowledge, keepers of roots, recipes for hafting or medicines, and memories of seasons when herds moved elsewhere. If a person survived into the later years, their memory could hold generations of solutions to drought, cold, and scarcity. They transmitted that knowledge through steady demonstration and stories, shaping habits as much as teaching facts. Picture an older hand pointing to a track and naming the herd's likely turn, or tasting a bitter root and explaining how to leach it before roasting. In quieter moments, they mended bindings, worked leather, or twisted cordage, tasks seen ethnographically and hinted at in tool and wear studies, practical work that steadied a camp. Some argue that this accumulated wisdom helped schedule not only the day, when to leave for the shore, when to bank the fire, but also the year, forecasting lean times from small signs that others might miss. A gust of wind would bend the hair on a neck, and an elder noticing that small sign could urge earlier departure. That slow archive of memory and habit passed by teaching and by example braided calm into the daily rhythm, and when storms or predators threatened, could make the difference between surviving and perishing. Which brings us to the ways people read danger in the land and planned to meet it. Most days ended in a simple promise: we will move when the things that matter run low. Archaeology and the long record of movement together suggest short stays were normal. People raked embers into hot pockets, folded bedding, lifted the handfuls of ash they used as tinder, and walked toward the next patch of clean water or fresh wood. The landscape decided the rhythm, where plant and animal foods shifted with the seasons. Groups shifted too, not as aimless wanderers, but as people who knew particular routes and favored stopping places. This was practical work, checking pots of food, stripping a few useful branches, and gathering what could be carried without slowing the group. Meals were often warmed, leftovers, tools were packed, children learned how to shoulder small loads and keep pace. This movement was not random. Groups followed familiar tracks and returned to favored camps when the seasons allowed. A child might cup a handful of warm coals for the next fire, the air smelling of smoke and damp earth as the party set off. The stones left behind tell the rest of the story. When flakes at one site physically refit to cores at another, or when unusual rocks appear far from their source, the pattern looks planned. Raw materials moved across the map, and so did people, sometimes in circuits that returned to the same rendezvous points. Such movements made gatherings possible, places to swap tools, pigments, and news about herds or reed beds. The repeated routes acted like a map written in memory, so people could predict who and what they might meet. Like beads on a string, camps and stopping places linked the landscape into a network of shared knowledge. Travel days were practical and social, at once a steady choreography of carrying, sharing, and looking ahead. As embers were tucked and packs adjusted, who would they meet on the path to the next camp, and what would they bring back with them? Sometimes the small things tell the largest stories. Stones of the wrong color, beads made from distant shells, and lumps of pigment turn up far from the places they must have come from. Mediterranean shells were carried to sites across Europe. Even 1,000 kilometers from the coast, shells at Udinovo seem to have come from the Black Sea. A journey of at least 680 kilometers, other fossil shells and bits of amber traveled hundreds of kilometers to be worked into beads. These patterns suggest more than chance loss on a long walk. People visited, left objects with neighbors, or passed gifts along routes that stitched distant camps together. The record even shows pigments placed in shells before modern humans appear nearby, which indicates that using color as social signal was not an innovation only of one group, but part of shared practice across certain regions. In plain terms, objects moved not merely as goods, but as signals about knowledge and trust. Those movements did a practical job as well as a social one. Exchanging stone and pigment created a map held in people's heads who knew where the herds had last passed, which reed beds were thick, which ledges held flint. Trade and repeated visits built a buffer against the day-to-day surprises of a changeable world. When food was thin, a distant friend's bead or a core of good rock could mean the difference between fixing a broken tool now and going without. Imagine a walker arriving with a smooth shell, the circle of faces leaning closer by the embers. The landscape became threaded with trusted places, and people a web that made futures a little less uncertain. As evening fell and embers were coaxed into life, Those same threads shaped what was cooked who sat near the fire, and the plans whispered for the morning. As daylight thinned, the camp slowed into a gentler rhythm. People gathered near the hearth to coax long-lived embers back to life, or to bank them carefully. Smoldering coals could be covered and fed so they would last through the night. Where hearths are clear in the record, burned bones and patches of heat-altered material suggest meat was roasted, and that fire shaped the evening meal. Fire did more than warm bodies, it lengthened the social day, gently allowing work to spill into hours that would otherwise be dark. In some human societies, cooking is a daily organizing task, and that ethnographic pattern helps us imagine how shared food could arrange workloads and expectations. Who would watch the fire, who would tend children at the edge of the glow, who would finish the last pieces of meat, or scrape clean a bone for marrow. The work of the evening was practical and quietly social. Knives and scrapers were cleaned, and sharpened flakes swept from near the hearth, and bone fragments sorted between food and fuel. Small hands learned by watching the adults pass a hot stone or hand over a strip of meat, and elders passed on news. Where game had been seen, which patches of plants were ripe, whether visitors were expected. These conversations carried planning as much as gossip. Information about water, wood, and distant rocks helped set tomorrow's route, and who would carry which load. As coals were banked for safety and warmth, someone kept a short watch, listening to the low hiss of cooling embers and the quiet maps of plans being made. In that hush, the camp prepared to sleep, yet the embers promised a night of sparks and a quiet guard who would wake the group if the dark shifted, leading into the slow work of night watch. When daylight thinned, the camp rearranged itself around slow heat. People folded into blankets or furs close to the hearth, not far from the last red coals, because fire offered light warmth and a thin circle of safety. In some traditions, embers were banked and fed so the glow would not die. Someone kept watch, adding small sticks, feeling for smoke and sparks. The soundscape was low, and warm stones cooling a soft cough of smoke, the rustle of hides. In colder places, groups huddled together around flames, sleeping more and moving less, until weather eased. Fire turned the night from threat into a shared, manageable space. Keeping embers alive shortened the work of morning, making it easier to wake to warmth and light. Archaeology records the habit of keeping fire at the center of daily life. Repeated hearth placements, layers of ash, and signs of renewed sleeping surfaces suggest camps were planned with night comfort in mind. Caves and shelters show careful choice of place, partly because dens once harbored large predators. Light and vigilance mattered. Around those hearths, people mended tools, passed on stories, and taught children by firelight, talk that could stretch into imaginative or practical realms. Injured or older members could be tended beside the embers, and the pattern of tending fuel and guarding the coals braided care into routine. By firelight, a child handed a warmed stone to an elder, learning where to sit and when to be quiet. Stone keeps its own memory. Charcoal, trampled floors, and compacted bedding preserve the outline of an evening. Like a small lighthouse, the hearth guided who slept and who kept watch through the dark. The banked fire was both technology and social stage. Safe sleep was a group task, and wakeful attention at night conserved the life of the camp. How these shared watches and fires changed from place to place is the next quiet question we follow. Across the long span of the Paleolithic, the daily script stayed surprisingly familiar. Regardless of species, people rose to secure calories, to keep warm and safe, and to pass on the know-how that kept the group alive. Early members of our genus worked with simple, sharp flakes and pounding stones, tools good for slicing meat or cracking marrow, and useful whether a carcass had been hunted or taken from a cat's leftovers. Later groups imposed a clearer mental plan on stone, making shaped handheld tools that reflect a template applied to rock. At another step, techniques like prepared core reduction and hafting appear in the record. These innovations did not invent daily life, but they likely made parts of it quicker and more predictable. Less time spent shaping a cutting edge, more time for repairing shelters, tending children, or setting traps. Social rhythms also varied. Some hominin groups were tightly knit and face-to-face in their talk and care, while others left traces of wider contacts and exchanged materials across the landscape. Such exchanges smoothed shortages and spread useful ideas and techniques between groups. The workday itself was a weave of small, repeated tasks. Morning light showed embers glowing at hearths, hands picked tiny flakes from piles of debris and refitted tools at the fire's edge. Some days were for careful foraging of plants and shellfish, others were for stalking, ambushing, or watching herds. Children hovered near warm stones, learning by imitation, as adults sharpened edges and fixed hafts. As dusk fell, fires were banked, and plans were exchanged for the next circuit through the country, because the land, forest, savanna, or steppe, kept asking for a different rhythm of work and care. At times, a low wind or a river's call regulated movement and attention. What did each landscape ask of them next? Dawn on the mammoth steppe came as a pale, long light across a flat, frozen grassland. In winter, people lingered where resources concentrated: river valleys, blind gorges, and places where migrating herds funneled past. Evidence suggests many bands stayed in the same spot for months, drawing on the heavy, dense stores a cold season demands. Mammoth bones and tusks became both fuel and building material at some sites. Vast piles of bone were shaped into huts or windbreaks, and bone may also have been buried or packed into permafrost to preserve dense meat and fat. Hearths with partially burned bone point to repeated fires, kept close to living spaces, their embers carrying warmth and a faint, steady smoke that cut through the clean air. The work of winter filled long, thin hours. People gathered any wood they could find and carried heavy, oily meat back to a central place. Large bones show signs of deliberate splitting and breakage, consistent with exposing marrow or packing rich portions for later. Use careful storage kept calories where they mattered. Near the hearth there was hidework, scraping, stretching, and stitching that made covers for shelters, rugs for sleeping, and clothing to blunt the wind. Where a femur might support a grill, a long night's fire softened fat and made tough meat more edible. Maintenance, mending bindings, resharpening tools, rebuilding windbreaks, was as essential as hunting itself. Outside, the sleeping ring, conversations and plans threaded the cold. The camp's shape, paved floors, bone walls, banked embers, shows a season of intense upkeep and shared labor rather than short visits. Winters on the steppe were organized around keeping heat, food, and shelter close. Elsewhere, on islands and in milder places, the same human needs were met with different materials and rhythms. How did those other landscapes ever reshape a day? On a small island like Flores, daily life fitted the land like a palm into a bowl. The people there were small-bodied, described in the field as about a meter tall with an ape-sized brain, and they lived in an ecology that favored careful local routines. The archaeological traces from Liang Bua showed delicate stone tools, possible signs of burning, and even evidence of hunting young stegodonts. These clues sketch a day where morning light sent foragers along limited shorelines and through scrub to gather tubers, small game, and whatever shellfish or plants the place offered. A morning might begin with salt on the air, small hands prying limpets from rock, and someone coaxing dull embers back to life. Fire was not an occasional spectacle, but a careful appliance. Coals tended in a confined space, used to warm food, crack bone, and treat plant foods that otherwise would be hard to digest. Those ordinary tasks, sharpening flakes following known foraging circuits, banking embers, simply scaled to smaller bodies and smaller prey. Their bodies and tools meant trips were short, prey smaller, and energy carefully budgeted. Delicately made tools suggest steady upkeep. Burned patches and worked bone imply a hearth-centered camp life. Like a well-tuned pocket economy, every scrap and flake had purpose. Because caves concentrate remains, researchers must ask which layers record which occupations. Scholars remain cautious about who made every layer in the cave and how old some of the evidence is, but the pattern is clear in island life. Efficiency and care mattered. The same human rhythms, tool repair, shared meals, watchful nights, played out in a different key. Was the cave home, workshop, or a brief shelter on a longer route? The next section walks out of the hearth and into the wider question of caves in the human story. Caves loom large in our imagination because they keep a record where the open air does not. The archaeological story is plain. Caves and rock shelters preserve sediments, hearths, and layers of debris that can pile up into deep, readable sequences. That preservation created the caveman image, but the evidence suggests most people did not live deep underground as a rule. Caves are often cold, wet, and full of rough stone, yet at their mouths, and in nearby shelters, they offered a useful windbreak, a place to tend fires, and a dry floor when weather demanded it. In a few places, some chambers in the French Pyrenees or the Great Caves at Gibraltar, hearths and debris reach far inside, showing that people sometimes entered deep spaces. Other chambers seem to have been visited for special purposes, and at times only after many generations had passed. Imagine a thin column of smoke slipping from the mouth as someone dries meat, and mends a worn strap. Those small acts leave traces. So how did a cave function in daily life? The picture is not that of permanent underground towns, but of mixed use. Caves served as hubs, shelter in bad weather, storage for bulky materials, and a protected place to gather around a fire. Nearby open-air zones were often the real workshops and campsites. Archaeologists point to places where tool-making clusters sit beside living floors, and to famous workshop concentrations near good stone sources, showing intense craft work in the open. At times, caves also hosted acts of meaning, marks, pigments, or special deposits, separate from ordinary chores. Small repeated chores, raking ash, stacking bones, and reknapping dull edges, built the layered floors we now study. We read these behaviors in hearth lenses, tool scatters, and layered floors. The next step is to look at those traces closely and ask what they tell us about a single day. Pigments ground into powder on a flat stone, beads smoothed by careful fingers, a bone or pebble scored with a repeated line. The archaeology suggests these were ordinary threads in daily life, not only the climax of a special ceremony. Early people carried small portable things that marked bodies and bundles, a string of beads, slipped beneath a wrap, a smear of pigment along a cheek, an engraved token tucked into a pack. These acts could have begun at first light beside the hearth, continued between mending hides and sharpening tools, and been renewed at the evening fire. The work was tactile and quiet, the grit of pigment under thumb, the coolness of shell against skin, the gentle scrape that left a deliberate mark. Such objects were practical as well as symbolic. A bead could fasten a bundle, a pigment could seal a repaired seam. A hand working these small tasks would have known the rhythm of the day, quiet, repeated, reliable, like the steady turn of a pot on a low fire. Over time, these small touches accumulated into visible signals of belonging and memory. Because pigments, beads, and engraved objects appear in some regions well before large-scale cave painting, ritual likely threaded through ordinary tasks, rather than standing apart. A child might learn the pattern of beads while passing a pebble to an elder. A hunting group could mark a shaft before setting out. A grieving person might wrap a find for safekeeping during a pause in the day's work. These gestures made identity portable and durable, binding people to one another across moves and seasons. What counted as ritual and how often it was woven into the everyday is part of the larger puzzle we will now approach. An open question about where routine ends and meaning begins. From the first coaxing of coals to the banked ember at night, a small bundle of practical habits quietly held life together. Evidence suggests that making and tending fire, shaping durable stone tools like hand axes, and passing techniques from one person to another were not one-off genius acts, but everyday routines. The smell of warmed meat and roasted roots, the soft rasp of fibers being twisted into cordage, the cool weight of a string of beads being threaded. These were the textures of ordinary labor. Plant fibers were gathered and prepared with care, fragments of cord, and the surprising survival of a bit of rope remind us that carrying, binding, and fixing were common skills. Ornaments made by long, patient hands hint that marking the body and sharing identity also crept into daily life. At dusk, an index finger wipes grit from a bead, the thumb tracing a tiny drill hole warmed by the fire. What kept those habits alive was people learning from people. Many researchers argue that our ancestors were especially good at social learning. They cooperated in hunts, and in gathering, they shared the calorie-rich parts of carcasses, and they taught one another how to keep tools sharp and shelters mended. Skilled napping traditions passed down with such fidelity that whole communities could maintain complex techniques across generations. In that steady exchange, child at the hearth edge watching, elder showing how to pass a hot stone, a neighbor mending a broken strap, knowledge accumulated and persisted. This learning happened in many places and seasons. Those routines are not vanished curiosities. They are the same patterns that shape how we plan, prepare, repair, and teach today. Near the last glow of embers, when laundry is folded and tomorrow's list is half formed, you can almost hear the long echo of a day that taught us to do things together. By dusk, the camp gathers where the coals still glow. Smoke lifts in slow ribbons, and the smell of warmed meat and roasted roots softens the day's sharp edges. Evidence suggests fire did more than stop the cold. It lengthened the social day, turning a place to eat into a place to teach, to mend tools, and to trade news about where water and game were found. Around those embers, people tended small tasks, raking ash, passing a hot stone, reworking a haft, while others kept a low watch. The heat and light made work possible and made space for words that might otherwise have been left unsaid. Under that light, lessons were short and practical. How to tie a shaft, where to cut meat, how to read tracks. If a linguistic threshold was crossed soon after 400 years ago, night talk could have reached beyond the mundane to stories of ancestors or the weather of remembered winters. Even without firm speech, music and marks appear in the later record. Pigments, beads, and instruments suggest evenings were also for making meaning. Care shows up here too. Healed bones tell of long tending, and the presence of children and elders implies a passing down of craft and place knowledge by the fire's edge. These are not theatrical rites set apart, but woven into cooking and mending in the same rhythm that kept bellies full and bodies warm. Sometimes a bead was threaded or ochre ground into a paste, small acts that held social meaning. This ordinary ritual, heat food voices, was a human technology as important as any hand axe. Understanding it is not nostalgia, it is a map of how people learn to make ordinary days enough. Not spectacle but habit, These evenings made knowledge portable across seasons and generations. What small, steady things from those circles of embers live on in our slow evenings today?